session and make it available alongside the others on our YouTube playlist, if folks ever want to go back and refresh themselves. All right, and I'm just keeping an eye on the event list. I know Maureen had said Ron should be able to join. I think at least for the folks that have joined, I might just kind of give a quick recap of kind of what we're hoping to do in terms of kind of our special topic governance session today. So for those who haven't read the InfoCentral post, effectively, while we were thinking about kind of canceling the session for today a couple weeks ago, is part of our profiling process where we're putting in tickets and reviewing some of the outstanding or new errors that are produced in the guide. We came across a particular challenge that we want to bring to this community to walk through. So we'll have kind of a recap on, the process that led us here in kind of Elliot's discovery, as well as talk through some of what our options might be. But more importantly, I think one of the topics that we want to make sure we talk to today is, or I should say that the perspectives that we hear from today is trying to get your opinions and your thoughts about how impacts, what impacts you would experience as an author or a developer or a program person, should we make a choice one way or the other to change or maintain our canonical URLs. So I want to frame that up front, and then we'll actually kind of talk about and try to document some of those impacts that we would anticipate so that it can help inform what decision we make moving forward. Any questions before we actually kind of frame up the why are we here today piece? No? Okay. All right. So huge thank you, Elliot, for not only just discovering this as part of your help in identifying, areas that we needed improvements, but also in kind of trying to frame this on the community. For those that you have just joined, I did put the kind of that framing piece describing kind of what we're going to talk through today in the chat. It's on InfoCentral Forum. And Elliot, tell me if you want me to walk through this. I've tried to, based on our conversations earlier in the week, put together kind of the factors that kind of led to us kind of identifying this challenge with our canonical URL, or just jump in and correct me if I'm missing any steps. But essentially, I think it was the last profiling call, Elliot, you'd asked, as part of our process, are we having a step where we're going through our QA report that's part of what it gets produced with the CI build that gets generated in IG Publisher? And, should we be putting in these tickets individually? Should we be putting them in as a group? Can we make sure that we're keeping up with the updates that regularly come out from that set of tooling that assess, errors that previously just didn't have code written to check for them? And for those that want to follow along, I've got in our actual CI the CI build of the CA baseline, you can actually see where some of these error logs. Oh yeah, of course, Thomas, I can in the Zulip.
I've got it.
Oh, you got it? Okay, beautiful. Okay, so Elliot's going to post the Zulip discussion, and then right above there, you can actually work alongside us if you're interested in looking at the QA report. So when we first did the 1.0.0, when we said, you know what, we're ready, we've resolved outstanding issues that we can make changes to, we were using what the publisher produces in the QA report and going through it and saying, okay, well, we know that there are some outstanding issues that we can ignore based on, us not having some resolvable value sets here in Canada. And we know that there are kind of we went through that and confirmed, anything that we're seeing on this QA report as an error or a warning is expected, and it's not a correction that needs to occur. But as a tooling is continuously being improved, essentially what happens is there's more and more time and effort spent to having more sophisticated checks performed. And so over time, as just a natural part of the process of using this tooling, there's going to be more errors and warnings that pop up as those checks are performed. And some of the errors and warnings that have been in the more recent IG publisher updates have been around things that are like checking against templating and checking against, for example, the one that we've identified, whether or not there are subsequent extensions that are relevant and present based on other kind of metadata or information in your implementation guide file. So if you claim, for instance, like the CA baseline does, that you are published at hl7.org/CA, that convention is recognized in the tool. And that convention says, oh, this is someone publishing at HL7 International. I now know to execute a subsequent set of checks to look for content that I expect from guides that are published through HL7 International. And that's ultimately kind of the error that led to a further discussion on Zulip that's in that meeting chat around why we're getting this and how to resolve it. So this error says when HL7 is publishing a resource, that owning committee must be stated using this extension. So it's an extension to claim the work group, right? And this working group is essentially, it has a controlled terminology, and I think that terminology is pulled from, where is that? A list of working groups at HL7 International. And so effectively what it said was, we saw you were using this convention on your profiles. So for us, I'll pull up our condition real quick. You guys may be familiar with this, but this canonical convention, hl7.org/FHIR/CA baseline, that error triggers now. Whereas it just previously there wasn't code written to check for that, or potentially the rule that is being enforced here hadn't been written yet. So just kind of bringing us back here. Effectively, we now have an error, and we now know from the FHIR community that that error is something that we need to at least come to a decision on how to resolve or mitigate. So the other piece I wanted to just call out from Elliot's summary is, you know, that those types of errors are anchoring on this thing called the canonical URL. And ultimately, one of the mitigation patterns or resolution patterns that we have to look at is, you know, do we change the thing that is actually creating the error in the first place? So why it's important is that, you know, when we have a profile or a value set or an extension or a code system, we use the canonical URL as the way to uniquely identify that artifact. And that gets plugged into more than just authoring profiles, right? That way of uniquely identifying the artifact you're referring to gets used in conformance processes like validating that your instances are compliant to the nominated profile. It uses that canonical URL to say, okay, I know what you're asking, and I'm going to go check against that in this location or against something that is published with that URL. The same goes for it being critical when it comes to both kind of the structure of content as well as the conformance check against that content for things like code system. So when we have essentially a code value pair, or sorry, a value system pair for codes in Canada and elsewhere, that code system is going to have its own code system canonical URL if it's been published, you know, with this as a FHIR artifact. And so there are implications to not changing your canonical URL willy-nilly, because there's dependencies and there's tooling and there is integration that relies on knowing what you called and identified your artifact using. Elliot, because I think this was one of the really key pieces that you called out. Is there anything I'm missing in terms of like examples that will help people understand and assess the impacts in a few slides?
Sure. So if you've got a instance that claims that it meets a particular profile, and you've coded it up so that it's got the profile's canonical URL in it, and we suddenly change the canonicals that we're identifying the CA baseline profiles by, then if the receiving system is looking for one canonical URL as the profile's identifier, and you're supplying a different canonical URL as the profile's identifier, then the system will say your instance doesn't meet that profile, the profile it's looking for. If you are writing a implementation guide, if you've published an implementation guide that is derived from CA baseline, it's going to say all of its profiles are derived from such and such a canonical. But if we, again, change that canonical, then there may be challenges in terms of resolving what that base one actually is supposed to contain. So potentially changing the canonical could have impacts to both IG authors as well as implementers.
And those impacts can be like basically think about it like a modified, or that there's like a scale of severity the more and more kind of mature and stable artifacts are supposed to be. So in the beginning, when we're like working through this, we actually had a canonical URL when we were first starting that was like, I think it even had the term draft in it, but we were really, really like iterative, and there weren't a lot of users then. And like, the idea was this was just a place for us to play, and the expectations were that these things could change. But as we progress in maturity and people become more and more dependent and they do these actions that Elliot has mentioned, then that increases the potential con that we have to evaluate. So I think it's like, I don't know if it's like an axis, but I think there's like definitely that part of the consideration, which is like how much control over telling people and having these changes go into place do we have based on the degree of use.
Yeah.
So I'm just going to go to the next slide. So we kind of talked a little bit about this, but the idea was that we had put in a convention that HL7 now kind of elicits an error for, because that convention in our canonical URL basically is saying that this is an artifact that's being published by HL7.org, by HL7 International. And at the time when we were doing the deciding, what will our new canonical be, we really just had the US core to look to, right? So we looked at their convention, which follows an HL7.org/FHIR/US, because they were putting their realm here, so their US realm. But in the subsequent like bloom that we saw of affiliates and kind of pseudo affiliates putting out their bases and their cores, there were essentially folks that were putting out implementation guides that were following more of like, I guess what you might call an affiliate convention. I'm not sure if it's ever been communicated, but the idea was you publish in a domain that isn't HL7.org, whether that's HL7 Italia or HL7.de for Germany or something else. Essentially what it was saying was, this is a published artifact that is governed and maintained by something else other than this. And so these rules are basically saying, if you're going to say that you're publishing under HL7.org, under this convention, even if you are making it clear that this is your realm, that incurs governance expectations and process expectations. So, and this is the part I was hoping Ron would have joined, but that's still kind of a little bit confusing to me. I think we still need to.
Yeah, I did get a Skype answer back saying he was trying to finish
Yeah,
up a call and that he'd be here shortly.
Okay, good.
he's on his way. I was having a little chat with him, so.
So we might circle back because he might have some answers to like, how much does the realm versus affiliate difference really matter? But at least what we know to date is that the like per gram, if you're going to use this convention, it means that you're going to be subject to some like formatting expectations as well as some process expectations. So I've got some of that pulled up here. I'm going to put, ooh, this is a weird URL. I'm just looking at it for the first time. I'm hoping this actually works, but I have it pulled up as well.
And Ron's here now.
Oh, beautiful. So Ron, we were just essentially framing the topic of discussion today around what Graham and HL7 International has raised in terms of expectations for guides that publish using the convention of hl7.org/FHIR/their realm, and how we kind of came about discovering the new errors that publisher is now creating for that. So
That's
like,
old school. Okay, no good. Okay, cancel.
oh, sorry, Ron, you might, can you hear us? Might just ping him. Joni, do you mind pinging Ron and just letting him know he's mic'd? He might not hear us, but we can hear him. So just circling back to this thought, the idea is that there's published rules if you're going to follow this convention and try to say you're publishing through HL7 International because this is the canonical. And I've got those.
I'm not sure those rules are published, are they?
Well,
did you find?
It depends on, so it's weird, right? Like, so if you go to the piece in the chat, let me pull it up. The link in the chat, you should see, I think it's this implementation guide requirements. Just make sure this is the same link. Yep. Okay. So I don't know, Lorraine, like it's a page that used to just be maintained by the FHIR product team. I don't know if it's been like, I don't know what the rules are here. Like if this is gospel truth, I have to imagine it's as close as we know to gospel truth about what the expectations are. But this is a document that modifies, that's been modified many times over the last few years. Does anyone know? Like, I mean, when the product director says you need to follow this, I think practically we probably should follow this, but it may mean we have some ability to push back if it's never really been exposed to the community seriously.
Yeah, I think it's been exposed. It may have been discussed within FMG or FHIR. I've never seen it as anything more than Graham's rules. And so what the weight they have, I don't know.
So Graham's rules have a lot of weight.
Yeah.
But my experience is that they're not always final. Other members of FMG and FHIR sometimes have different opinions.
I would agree.
And so, I'm going to skip past some of this information because like, I think we can review, like there are definite rules here that impact things like how we're packaging and, consistency and what we do for finding our versions, that kind of thing. But the piece when it comes to governance, like that I think we should drill into, and I don't have the answer because I haven't really dug into this, is what are the things that are here that would impact our process for, like, should we choose to keep at our current convention? What would be our updates to our plans for ballot and management over time, and like our expectations for who has the ability to control our governance processes. And there's a couple things here that I thought it might be helpful for us to dig into. Because it's, at least when I started looking, this seems kind of innocuous, I guess, because there's, basically you've got to like identify this is an HL7 International, identify your working group name, you've got to ensure that you get this through the IG proposal process. A lot of this feels more like templating. But if you look at the IG proposal process and you dig more into,
It's not straightforward.
no,
It's not straightforward, and although, nothing on that page feels ridiculous, it does require, for example, a work group sponsor.
so that's this piece. So this, and then the proposal goes to the sponsor as well, right?
Well, the proposal has to come from the sponsor.
And you've got to create a PSS and get a work group sponsor for the PSS even before you.
All right. So, yeah.
So Ron, for some context.
Yeah.
We're using and have been since near the beginning of the baseline work. We've been publishing our stuff at hl7.org/FHIR/CA, just like the US does /US.
Yes.
Okay.
And
We haven't been publishing it there. We've just been using that canonical.
actually, if you go and look, it's there. At least that's where I look it up.
You're saying like the FHIR org iGuide registry?
Well, where I go is I go to the build.fhir.org and then list of IGs and look up Canada and then get to it from there. Now, maybe it's wrong, or maybe it's not actually published to that URL, but it's published on the HL7 site somewhere.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so
And-
here, keep going. I've got a basic concern that I think I'll have to take to the International Council. But keep going.
Well, that's why we want to involve in the conversation. And I guess we're the only ones other than the US that are doing that. Most other affiliates, when you go to the baseline, what is the URL
So
from there?
Yeah.
Actually, if you go to there's another link there that actually works, but
is it the CI build one?
yeah.
Yeah.
It's build.fhir.org IGHL7 Canada CA baseline. Okay, so that's slightly different than what we've been using as our canonical URL. But most people, like Germany, uses HL7.de for Deutschland. There's a .au for the Australia one, etc. It's what most of the affiliates do because they go through their own processes for developing the guides. So where you came into the conversation was there are now requirements to be publishing with an HL7 international URL, which mostly are around the processes for creating an HL7 international published guide, which is what Shannon's got there. So I think you're roughly caught up now.
Okay, all right, that's good. So, so even just with a quick glance, because I haven't been following this, unfortunately, I was offline for like really a couple of weeks, pretty solid with myself immersed in something entirely. Well, not entirely, it's something else. But anyway, here's the issue, which has become very apparent to me just recently. This assumption that the working groups are the gatekeepers or the gating mechanism for international IGs will not scale. It will not scale. Everybody has to do it. Secondly, in many cases, you know, you're gonna be working on IGs that are not singular in purpose, or that you may have to have across multiple working groups if you're actually gonna accomplish something a little more, you know, with more dimensions of what the resources are that are tied to it than not, or the profiling for that matter. So what I've been thinking about lately a great deal is I think we need a new construct. This may be a bit radical for Graham and company and for the FHIR management team, but what I think working groups should be doing is a separation of concerns between what's definitional at a foundational place in terms of resources, in terms of methodologies, things like that. There should be a cleaner delineation between the participation from the base standard, if you will, or the standards framework that is FHIR, and then the actual utilization of that framework in terms of implementation guides, particularly multinationally. And I don't mean all joint, I mean, you know, any country that's decided it's gonna have a series, right? So that needs to be a different governance model than we have today, because the working groups were not designed ever to be supporting multiple iterations globally of IGs. The working groups were designed to produce the fundamental standards that underpin this thing.
There is a process that exists for affiliate projects to come through international. As a matter of fact, Paul's brought, now these are base resources, I think, not an implementation guide.
Okay, good.
The claims stuff
Yeah.
that the Saudis are doing through FM. So he's actually balloting it through financial management.
Right.
But I don't think we want all of our affiliates to be doing that.
No, we don't. So he and I have had some, shall we say, lively conversations about this. Although I think he and I are getting much more aligned on this topic. But so here's the issue. The issue is that I'm trying, I have this idea in my head and I floated it now with a few people. So I'll float it with yourselves, and then I'm going to actually document this and try and do something with it very soon. But the idea is this: when we talk, you know, remember all my frustration over time, we looked at how many voters there are in HL7 International, which isn't international, it's really mostly HL7 USA. And then you look at that, you know, shifting in terms of landscape, in terms of what's out there. I realize it's not so much the voting that matters, it's how can HL7 be credible? And this is a mission I'm on right now, and I'm officially on this mission on the board, is how do we make HL7 International more successful internationally, where the affiliates live and breathe, and also to create that incentive for others perhaps to join. And the key is this: it occurred to me one day that if first, you know, my whole thing that I've been doing around the value proposition of you behaving in an SDO-ish manner as a virtue, and something that any health ministry in any country should value in terms of utilizing that type of approach and that community in terms of us, you know, marshaling their stakeholder community, you know, incorporating HL7 into their digital health ecosystem in a way where it has a relationship, and essentially the affiliate represents to HL7 International, and then from HL7 International back into their own country, you know, the mechanisms around how to utilize the standards, what the standards actually are in terms of achieving things that are fit for purpose in a particular country. So that's been my assumption all along. But the issue becomes this very quickly.
Yeah.
Sorry. So the
okay, go ahead. I was going to draw us back, but
because I want to make sure we bring it back to like the things that we might be able to kind of like immediately impact, and like recommendations that we can make.
All right. So let me put it this way then. I'll try and be very, very concise about this. I am looking at a better separation of concerns between the mechanisms for supporting international IGs that are not related to the SDO side of the organization, but to the implementation support side of the organization. And the only things that go back to the SDO organization are, frankly, around the FHIR, and we're talking FHIR, resources and resource definitions, impacts or changes that are desired for those resource definitions, and potentially changes in the infrastructure elements of FHIR that are needed, you know, that may be not working for people that need to be addressed. And I would like that to be under the auspices of the SDOs working groups. Okay, because that's, we blurred the line between what the SDOs used to be and what they are today. And I think we've overloaded them, frankly, from a governance perspective. We need to change this, and we also functionally need to do something different. Anyway, that's my thematic thing right now, and I'll stop there, and then we'll see how this all shakes out in terms of putting the kibosh on that or support.
Yeah, I think Randy brings up like I think a really salient point, which is like we've kind of been operating under this idea that when we started talking about the baseline governance and how we want to ballot, that we could construct the reasonable expectations that follow FHIR practices and the community process and engage our realm and our constituents in facilitating that governance. And so his comment about like we have these established working groups, we're looking at doing balloting. Like, I think we've been operating under the assumption that we could do this balloting through HL7 Canada. And I think that this point that we're really looking at is ultimately like, it's, do we have to pursue kind of this more HL7 international processes where we may not have the same amount of flexibility in defining exactly what our processes would look like and the minutia of that?
Yes.
Because we want to continue using the canonical. Or, I think do we think, Elliot, I saw you remove this, but like if there's a possibility of exception of us still being able to facilitate the governance that we desire through our Canadian affiliate while maintaining our existing canonical, I think is the win-win. But I think we don't know if that's possible, like to do an exception. And so
I think
yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Near term, that feels right to me. Longer term, I think there needs to be a conversation that's not going to be a quick conversation to have about this whole issue of the pragmatism as well as the functionality of what they're assuming today. What they're assuming today, in my opinion, I feel is viscerally, so strongly it's visceral, is that that's just not going to scale. There's just no way. And so anyway, I'll worry about the higher governance part of it, but I think in terms practically speaking, we need to make a clear separation of concerns between the standard itself and the implementation of that standard and how that's supported. That's the thing.
Yes. Well, our affiliate agreement, or the affiliate agreement in general, because I think we looked at the general one, not our specific one, on the Canada community call earlier this week, specifically says affiliates need to have the balloting process, but the process is theirs to determine.
Yes.
So, and of course, if we were using HL7.ca from the beginning, which we of course don't own, we wouldn't be having this discussion. It's because we're using an HL7.org URL. But I actually think I like Elliot's first spot. I think we should. Now it's not really a TSC decision, but we should petition HL7 to authorize us to continue to use the URL we're using. It's probably a Karen Van decision, Ron, do you think?
No, okay, not entirely. So the problem with the constructs around the URLs in terms of the namespaces, et cetera, and the things that we do is, Karen Van would see that as, okay, well, what's the guidance from the technical steering committee in terms of functionally how that works, what the challenges might be around it. Ultimately, Karen Van, if we present to Karen the business problem we're having as a result of this and the practical problem, I think Karen would be understanding. She would understand it. I don't know what the delineation is there in terms of accountabilities for actually making that decision. And I do believe
Lynn would have to be involved too, right?
Yeah, but so what we don't know yet is there's going to be changes in the relationship of the staff and HL7, because that's sort of morphed, as you should have seen the news releases or the releases from HL7 recently, and the fact that, you know,
That Mark is
HL7 is.
retiring, but it's
Mark
not
is
all,
retiring.
not all of that's public yet.
Yeah, no, not all of it is, but what's happening is that, you know, Dan Bremen, Viet, and Diego, particularly, have official executive roles, but they had no official reporting relationship or accountability down that stack. That's going to change a bit.
Yeah, so I'm wondering, like, because we don't know, and the
Yeah.
number changes.
Yeah,
Maybe what we say is, okay, so we've identified this as an option.
Yeah.
Can HL7 Canada take it back to say, would identify who the right individual is off call to figure out
yes,
who could do this exception? And then we
Yes.
can kind of figure out, because like what we know, we can't come to a conclusion of this is the right choice right now, but we could say, you know what, we want to like strike out one of these, or we want to pursue and kind of start branching out responsibilities to investigate and narrow down our options. And I think
Right.
one of the things that we can do with the folks in the call, particularly in relation to the baseline, is assess this impact. Because like we've talked about, you know, pursue this and expect process changes, pursue it and maintain the canonical, and petition for an exception. And then this one's kind of like the continued, like not addressing it, but maintain our canonical. The option that we haven't really talked about in depth is, do we change our canonical? Do we change it to something like hl7canada.ca/baseline? Because that is an option. But to the point that Elliot was making earlier on the call, that will have technical impacts on many of us. And so
yes.
are folks comfortable? Can we talk about that portion for the remainder of the hour? Because that will really help us determine, do we think
Yes.
this one isn't even worth talking about? So
Good
like
approach.
these are the kind of categories that I brought up, which is like, you know, we talked about reprofiling. We talked about the impact of a canonical on validation. We haven't really talked about examples of folks who are like, who've written it into their solution codes, whether you're an app or you're a server or you're a repository. But I want to hear from you folks on like, if the canonical was to change tomorrow, where do you think some of the impacts, like, would you be impacted as an author or a developer or as a program lead? And talk to us about that impact so that we can use that to inform the decision.
So Randy's been chatting, so we should go take a look at that for a second,
Yeah.
Sharon.
Yeah, I find it really hard to follow the chat and the conversation at the same time.
Yeah, I think we need to pause for a second and catch up on the chat.
So your most recent one, because you had made a comment about earlier, Randy, the Canadian work groups that we did kind of bring up to say, you know, our goal is to be able to pursue and maintain our own governance. And I'm just looking at the last one, which is the technical impact. So you're saying, well, it might be big, it would be short term. So they like,
I guess it's going to depend upon context, because if you've reprofiled the Canadian baseline and then solution developers are developing against that more specialized profile, the change impact is minimized because it's just in the dependency on the structure definitions that are reprofiling.
Right.
Because if instances are coming in, as to Elliot's earlier point, and claiming conformance to a profile, hopefully they're claiming concordance to the more specialized profile. That might not be though, right? They might still be just saying CA baseline. I have no idea about what's going on in CA core and IPS.
so if the vendor is claiming, you're saying the specialized profile, like the
Then you just
impact
have to,
is around how the tooling is handling, like look up the thing in your cache to determine the rules that were in your snapshot.
Are we allowed specialized profile?
sure we are.
Yeah, I
You
mean,
can-
reprofiling is, that's what you meant, right, Lorraine? When you
Yeah,
said
like, I
specialized?
mean, there's a BC patient, right?
Yeah,
But that's called constraint, not specialized. Specialized only can be done at the base resource level, not
I
provider
was
level.
using the word specialized in a generalized way, not a technical way.
So
Yeah,
what's the
okay.
profile?
Mm.
Profile.
But I mean, the BC profile primarily has extensions and a few constraints against the Canadian baseline, but mostly it's extensions.
And so the way, like, so BC is being one of the folks that does reprofile from the baseline. Basically, somewhere in some system, and I'll need your help, and I like thinking through what this is. You've got your loaded BC profile, and you've got this indication of a dependency on the baseline and a base definition. So somewhere in that system, you've got both the baseline profile and the BC reprofile profile loaded.
But the system generates a snapshot with both together, right?
Yeah. And so is the idea that, like, if you know as an author that the canonical has changed, you just need to make sure that you update your canonicals in your profiles, or sorry, straight that back, your base definitions that point to the baseline canonical in your profiles. And is it like refresh what's in your cache?
Well, the bigger problem is going to be things like value set references and stuff,
Yeah.
right? And naming system references potentially.
So let's talk about that. So actually let's close it out. So the first one, is that true? Like, was my statement about as an author, you'll have to know and be like, the risk here is that there are people that we don't know that could be using this and that wouldn't get this messaging. You'll have to know, and you'd make the change in your base definition.
If it changed and couldn't resolve in the IG,
Yeah.
the continuous build process would break because it couldn't find the base that we're dependent on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
My sense, the most impact should comes from designing or under designing process. For those running in product, might not be impacted by this changes, canonical change.
Well,
Generally speaking, sorry.
Yeah, you can declare what profile you're conforming to, etc. But not everyone does because it's not a requirement in general. In an instant.
But generally speaking, with the best practice, that's why the value of the snapshot comes out. But generally speaking, for those implemented profiles, they need to count on the snapshot section to conform to the designed profile to create, send, and receive the instances. But for the designing part, it definitely heavily depends on the canonical URL.
But then that's true for profile definitions. And then let's think through value set references and things like that. Of course, right now we have challenges with looking at value sets and resolving value sets in the IG build if they're behind the terminology gateway, for example, because they won't resolve. But we're actually not using the same canonical for our value sets, are we? We're using an infocentral-info route.
For the ones that already exist that we're pointing at, yes. But there are ones, I believe, that we've created.
Let's see. Maybe it would be, I don't think it would be birth sex, because nope, that's one. Okay, so that's one value set.
So what was the canonical for that one? I just couldn't see, it went by too fast.
The CA baseline one.
Okay.
And this was one that was basically something that we just tried to recreate. We said, we anticipate that there's this value set in place with US core, or like in the future, like I think what we've talked about is using our canonical for value sets or extensions that are not available to us in R4 yet. But this is a definite one.
Mhm.
Uh,
Yeah, and the gender harmony ones are now in THO.
yeah.
Um,
I'm just gonna go through and just see if it's more than. Oh shoot, that was extensions. Whoops. I'm pretty sure these last ones aren't.
while you're looking, Ron, one of the other questions that came up in the email discussion was having HL7 Canada try to arrange to buy back HL7.ca from InterfaceWare.
And so that's kind of like a branching decision where it's like, if we did want to have, well, it's maybe an independent one, because there's a lot more things that we would be able to do beyond just the canonical URL. But I think we
Yeah,
have to make the decision about like whether or not we would even want, even if we had it today, to pursue the change.
well, we may not want to change this,
Yeah.
but I think that having control over HL7.ca would be a good thing independent of this discussion. So while you were looking, I was just drawing Ron's attention to that.
Yeah. So there's two value sets here. Oops. Birth, sex, and health condition code. And then our extensions, because we basically ran into that issue where if we had an extension that we wanted to use from someone else that wasn't resolvable, we republished. This would be the other place we see an issue.
Mhm.
So for value set, that will only be an issue during design time, right? Because in runtime, we don't see the value set URL, right? It's only the code system that we see.
And
Oh,
it's
so you mean
binding
like when
graph.
the instances, like it would be design and validation, because the instances would only ever include the code system, but the value set would be used to tell them this is what you input and to validate whether or not they've met your rule.
And when you're implementing, one of the first things you want to do is look up what are the valid values. Right? I mean, it may not be actually in an instance, but when you're doing development, you need to know.
So you would repoint if it's changed, right?
Yeah, so you would update your the new binding would include the new value set with a new URL, and folks who are utilizing the profile for validation would get that, I think, as a carry through, because the new binding would point to the new one. But people would need to know, you know, when you're designing, even though it looks different, it's the same.
May only the code system and the value set that have been created within this IG package might be impacted by the change of canonical URL, as Vinny mentioned. For any other value set and the code system with the URL being adopted shall not see any impact. Am I
Mhm.
right?
Do you mean like because we put the ones that would be a value set that would point to something on like the terminology gateway, that wouldn't be impacted because
No,
yeah.
it won't, even for that value set for in the instance, it never acknowledge the existence of the profile specifier.
Mhm.
There are a couple of ways a value set canonical can get into an instance. There is an extension on codable concept or coding. And you can say, here's the code and the system that I'm choosing. And just so you know, I'm choosing this because it came from, no, here was the available value set that I had my options in. I chose the value of 3 because my options were 1, 3, 5, and 7. Even though it's probably closer to a 4, but that wasn't available.
There are also a couple places where the profiles specify choices of value sets. And I don't know if that ends up in the instance if you're trying to say, I think that was might be one place you might use that extension to say, of the 2 value sets that I had available, I chose this one.
It's not the max and min. I'm just looking at the extension registry right now to find the example.
I can look for it
Perfect.
and
Okay.
get it for you.
But is anybody using that and using and pointing to the 2 ones that we have? Because I think like it's important to know from like everything we talk about here also applies to what you go home and you do with your own artifacts. But like, and so if you're utilizing this outside the baseline, this is still a helpful conversation. But with these being the only 2 value sets, so birth, sex, and health, well, that's a big one, health concern code. Although this is kind of interesting. I don't know what the impact would be because all we essentially do is say import all the codes from this existing value set, which wouldn't change. Do we expect that folks would fall into this kind of like,
Well, and given
scenario?
that definition that you saw before, we likely would have referred to the source code system and created a binding on that, but and referred directly to the info with central URL. Now, none of the stuff I'm working on has health concern codes in it because it's all registry stuff. So
what about extensions? Like, are folks, because this has been essentially anything I'm thinking on that list is likely to have the convention that uses the CA baseline URL. So that would mean a change in the instances, right?
Equivalent as a resources profile. Equivalent.
yes, it needs to, because an extension needs to have the URL of where it's defined. I don't think we're using very many Canadian extensions right now, but people might be.
Yeah, or anyone on the phone, like, are you using any of these extensions from the CA baseline today?
I know that Kai is interested in that no fixed address extension.
And do we know, like, from the framework perspective, we might be able to limit impact because if it's incorporated after a canonical change would occur, then it would be fine. But is it already in use to your knowledge?
No,
Okay, what about others? Role status, that's a V3 thing.
BC's got an extension, it's very similar to that, but not quite the same. So it's a BC extension, it's not a baseline.
So I think even like my call would be, because this would be something that impacts instances, which means it impacts vendors because they have to configure their systems to convey these things. And I think that's one of the things, like, we know as authors that are on this call, we have some control over what we do, but some of the impacts we have to assess is like, what would this mean to our end users? My ask is going to be like, for these, evaluate whether or not you're utilizing them in your production systems or you have expectations that are tied to those extensions specifically at the canonical URL of the baseline. And I think we should also probably put out a thing on Info Central to capture if anyone else is using them. Are there other pieces that, like, I think Thomas, you said it's unlikely that a lot of the products, like, because we haven't asked for the instances to contain meta profile, that there might be less impacts on vendors. like, are there any cases we can, like, either from our direct use or what we know of that would impact what gets written into the code of a system or what gets imported into a server?
Well, generally speaking, the URL, Canonical URL discussion more focus on the governance structure perspective, less than on a technical perspective. But here you're right, and there will see some impact. But my sense is actually the most impacts comes out from the, how to say, the trust or confidence on this piece of package, because Canonical URL is actually the really the foundation, the flag of this IG. So that will shake this confidence and the trust.
Yeah, I agree with Thomas. It's actually, I mean, we can always write code to fix things if we have to change things. But the business impact of the trust and the discussion and the process, I think, is even more important.
And it's that like, that it shows, like, is it an instability, or that we're now requiring folks that were using our content to make changes?
Yeah, I mean, so Mikesh, do you have any thoughts, like, from the BC ministry point of view?
Sorry, oh, in fact, I cannot say anything at this point.
Okay, thank you.
How does the, like, because I agree, I think, like, having a change at this stage is not what I desire, but what do we think about, like, how risky is this given where we're at in our own maturity? So we're at, you know, having just put out this is a draft, you can start using this. We've made one minor update, or, you know, one minor release, I should say, because there's been some patches that we've put in. But at the end of the day, like, you know, we have tried to be really clear about people about where we're at in our, like,
I think if we're going to
maturity.
change, we need to do it before we ballot.
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. And this is one of those issues where
Yes,
there's never
absolutely.
a better time to change than now.
Yeah, I agree.
So I
agree.
think my personal opinion is that we figure out how hard it will be to get an exception from HL7 International.
Yes.
Keep it, because I would prefer to keep the URL. But if it's really hard, then we change. That's sort of my opinion.
Is that a short-term thing, or is that for the long term, Lori?
I think that's for the long term. I mean, I frankly don't see any reason why affiliates can't use a URL that's formatted the same way the US one is.
I would actually agree with that. It would
And
be, for them to
whether,
argue otherwise, it's problematic.
and whether International Council might need to be involved in the governance, or, but we shouldn't have to go, but we should still be able to use our own development processes.
Yeah.
And maybe I'm just standing on my soapbox, but it annoys me that this has come up as a problem.
Yeah.
Yes.
So is it,
Yeah, go ahead.
sorry, Ron, I was just gonna say,
No,
so,
Fanny, go ahead. Yeah.
so, assuming that we really have to change the URL, could we minimize the impact to current implementer in a sense that we could keep the existing one so that they can continue to build on that, right? And then create another branch with the correct URL.
I think that's actually the worst of both worlds, because then we're propagating a problem that we have to take, that we're going to have to change. We're creating technical debt if we do that.
Yeah,
But-
I think
but-
just a single change.
But
And-
can you maybe put the different way? Like, are you referring to, because, like, we do have a package, so that will give people time that tomorrow, if we change this, things wouldn't break if they're dependent on a package. But I think the goal is to have, if we do choose to make a change, to have everybody be on board that when you have the capacity, you make the change. That is the long.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. I'm being pragmatic here in a sense that we don't want everyone broken, right? So if they built, they keep that compatibility, and then if they need some things in the new thing, then they'd have to move. But we won't force them to move if they don't have to.
Because you can't take, like, I guess, like, I'm thinking about it from the perspective of like, we do want people to move, and they will have to move eventually, but we don't want things to break overnight. And that's where I think releases and the packages comes into play, where if we wouldn't make another release, but if you had pointed to the CA baseline 1.1, then you have at least some time before, should we make the change, you have to make the updates.
Exactly. New functionality, we won't retrofit in the old
Well,
package.
unless HL7 International kills that URL.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
Well,
may-
they actually, I mean, we're not actually publishing at that URL.
You're right.
Which is why this hasn't come up earlier, because we haven't asked HL7 to let us publish there. So we would continue to have the same non-resolving URLs, canonical URLs that we currently have.
That was happening here, yeah.
Yeah. And it's just that the newer versions would have a different canonical URL, which hopefully we would choose one that we could actually resolve at.
Mm-hmm.
The challenge with continuing to support both new and old URLs is that every implementer needs to check for both. And every anywhere that they're checking for one, they need to check for the other. And so, I mean, I don't know that that's an option, but I wouldn't want to retract the packages that are already out there. But I also wouldn't want to encourage people to use the old ones, the old URLs, if we do move. Because if we can get everybody to move over at once, then it reduces the maintenance burden on everybody. I recognize that is not going to happen though. And so, yeah, I don't know where we go with that.
Well, and there's stuff going on like there's a group in BC producing developer support kits for people who are trying to write smart on FHIR apps, for instance. So the longer we wait, the more all the stuff propagates.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So I think our action items are, I've heard a couple here. So we need to figure out first and foremost whether or not an exception is possible, right? So that would be like here. So HL7 Canada, like probably we've got to do some homework on who that exception would go to and trying to get that run up the flagpole. We also have to like finalize that ask. So we've heard kind of minimal impacts, but I think we should put it to the community on InfoCentral. So I can put that post out on InfoCentral following, asking explicitly, are you leveraging any of these and what the impact would be should we choose to pursue a canonical change? Depending on what we hear, like when do we think it's going to take like a month to figure out whether or not it's going to be a yes or a no on this exception? And to Randy's point, and I think Thomas's point, it's going to be a continuous exception. Then we can maybe come back to okay, so if that's not possible, what's our communication strategy? When do we make the change? Which is the domain that we're using? Does that seem fair to folks? Like, let's just be aggressive about pursuing.
Mm-hmm. Ron, when is the next board meeting? Just for timing. Or is Ron gone?
You might have had, well, I'm looking and we're like 6 over, so I think.
No,
we're
Just
just
one
no.
thing.
folks.
Sorry, go ahead.
So, just to answer the board question, I'm just about to confirm this. It is Monday, this coming Monday, the 13th.
Because I was
I
going to
don't-
say that one of the challenges will be about getting answers from HL7 International, that US Thanksgiving is coming up in 10 days.
Well, yeah, the issue is that this is sort of a long weekend for them too.
Yes, because the federal holiday is today, not Monday.
Yes, I know, but I know of a few people who are taking, a little extra time, so to speak. But
Well, I
anyway,
mean, here it's Monday, but in the US it's today.
Yeah. Oh, no, I understand that, yeah.
So
Yeah.
if you think.
But
you can
my
get it-
expectation is if we try and go through HL7 for an exemption of some sort, January working group meeting would be the earliest that we would have it settled.
I think settled, yes. I think we need to actively work it. And we
Yes.
need to, talk about it, but I think we would need it settled there. Now, I'm absolutely certain that Graham and the management group, we're going to end up in some conversations about some of this, because I think we're going to be raising things that they've not considered. And secondly, there are definitely implications of what we're describing here, Sheridan, that I think the internationals may care a great deal about. And I think from a consistency perspective, we need to do it. And this comes back to me, like I'm sort of wearing my diplomacy hat here when I say, I need to talk to some people about the practicality and the scale, the sustainability of some of the assumptions that exist on the pages that you had showed, because I have never gone through those pages in detail.
Mhm.
But Sheridan, as soon as I looked at what you were showing there, I'm going, oh my God, like, no, this is a really big
But
problem.
what Sheridan had there was for the rules for what you have to do if you're creating an implementation guide that's balloted through HL7 International, not
Gotcha.
necessarily what's
Valid in the
in
affiliate.
an affiliate.
Yeah, and that's good. That's good because my working model has been, with the exception of this conversation with Paul. Paul's motivation regarding the Saudi financials is there are reasons for it that don't necessarily exist going forward.
And maybe
Well, I
we
mean-
can table some of that conversation because I know we're 6 minutes over.
Yeah, yes. I'm sorry.
Yeah,
Yeah, we are.
yeah.
Okay.
I think-
Anyway, I like this set of action items. I think we need to pursue it, but I think you're right. It'll be January before we
need
have
to
an
finish,
answer.
but we have in some cases chosen to take some of our standards through the international process. We don't do it often. But sometimes there are reasons for it. I just don't want to have to do it all the time.
Mhm.
No, I agree.
So
No, I don't think anybody does.
let's take our action items back. We've got another Canada Council call on the 21st. And I
Yeah.
think maybe in the meantime, in addition to the
Yeah.
info central, maybe on one
Yeah.
of the profiling calls, we can work on what's the statement that we should make in the meantime on our pages to let people know that this may or may not be a change that's occurring.
Yeah. Our first accountability is to inform
Yeah.
of a potential implication there, and to make that as broadly accessible as possible. Yeah.
Okay, so
Okay.
on that note, I'm going to stop the recording and we